I'm Paul Darcy from the Australian National University, and I work on Pacific history and environmental conflict resolution in the Asia-Pacific region. Taiwan has always been part of the Pacific, but for the ancient time, it's almost like it is the heartland, it's the acknowledged heartland of all Austronesian peoples, it's where we came from, but then it stops. And it's really only been since 2000, the last 10 years, that we've talked about Taiwan as part of the Pacific's contemporary identity and its future. But it's always been, again, cast in a continental mode. It's Taiwan versus China, using the Pacific for East Asian reasons, rather than what is actually the reality. Both China and Taiwan have long-standing histories with the region that are separate, that are distinct, and as I say, go back generations, and that needs to be reinforced a lot more, I think. So yet there is a tendency to ignorance towards Taiwan in the Pacific, or a cynicism almost to see it as really a means for foreign policy for Taiwan. That is changing. I've just been commissioned last year to write an article specifically on the role of East Asian powers in the Pacific. The Pacific History Association meeting next week has a whole session devoted to that topic, Taiwan and China in the Pacific. We're publishing a book next year out of Papua New Guinea talking about East Asian partners in resource development. So the mood is changing very rapidly in the next the last 5 or 6 years. The next 5 to 6 years, I think it will almost not be a question anymore. It'll just be taken as a given. Particularly since 2005, Taiwan has really stepped up quantumly in terms of its engagement with the Pacific, and particularly listening to the Pacific. I think there are multiple areas to move forward on. First and foremost, again, as an educator, perhaps I'm biased, but it's about enhancing your education capacity in Taiwan to teach Pacific studies. You've now got a coterie, a young cohort of young people coming through that are enthusiastic, they're smart, and they're hungry to learn about the Pacific. You've already started exchanges, but I think the baseline, you've got to have a Pacific Studies undergraduate program with potential to go on to graduate programs, enhancing those linkages, but building your own local capacity. Next year, or at the latest the year after, we're going to have Taiwanese students sharing the same courses as Pacific students across the Pacific, and probably the most exciting education development in the last 30 years in the Pacific, I think. We will all have a common series of themes, and students will be able to talk to each other on the web, on Facebook and other various media like that. So, that would be number one. Number two would be also not just the Austronesian link between the Aboriginal community and the Pacific community, but also Taiwan as an island nation. You have commonalities that in the whole of the Taiwanese population share with all Pacific nations. Your small island nations surrounded by very large continental powers that have interests, welcome and unwelcome, in the Pacific. And so you have that shared concepts of integrating with the outside world, participating in the global economy, and using smallness as a strength rather than a weakness. And in the last few years, China and Taiwan have respected each other's spheres, and they've not been aggressively attacking each other. It's been, I think, a very positive move. Taiwan has particular advantages, some that it's used, but some that it could use a lot more. I think your high tech in electronics is something that we in the Pacific need to look at. You actually have real competitive advantage in education. There's something you do very well, particularly the sciences, that we could learn in the Pacific. Fisheries, you're a distant water fishing nation. You're one of the top 2 or 3 fishers in the area. Distant water fishing nations have not always been speaking on the same page as the Pacific nations. So there's a real need there to work much more closely, not just to get fishing licenses and contracts, but actually to work in partnership with Pacific nations to make sure that the fishery is sustainable. All international agreements are based on mutual consent. You can't force people to do anything. So we have to come to terms. I think international law gets a bad name for basically trying to bring conflict resolution where there's not been resolution available by other means. It takes mutual consent. Mutual consent means that both parties have to see that it's in their interests. What we have at the moment is the so-called tragedy of the commons, where because international waters are seen to be owned by no one, everyone rushes in first to fish them out before they're exhausted. So I think there needs to be a common sense of ownership. At the moment, the law of the sea and international agreements are the best means we have to that, but there are better ways to enhance that. And as I mentioned at the conference, I think really Taiwan can take the lead here. You were the first distant water fishing nation to support Pacific nations' agreement to shark sanctuaries, with your partial move, which was a ban on shark finning. You're still going to fish shark, but you're going to stop the barbaric practice of finning the sharks and throwing them back. That was noticed in the Pacific. And again, as one of the top 3 or 4 fleets in the Pacific, you can make a difference. If your government, we know the fisheries is an important industry and no one's telling you to stop fishing, but if you start enforcing those regulations, if home governments enforce the regulations, it's much easier than for the host nation with 1 or 2 patrol boats to patrol huge economic zones. They can't do that, so they need the host nation, the host of the fishing fleet, to enforce those regulations. That may be enforce if there's a lowered fish catch, then governments have to step up to the plate and support those fishermen. No one wants the fishing industry to collapse. I've seen what happened in the Atlantic when the cod fishery collapsed. It was devastating. So what we need is both parties need to realise, both the host Pacific nations and the distant water fishing nations, for both our cases, we need that fishery to be sustainable. What we're seeing at the moment in the Pacific is once you put sanctuaries in place or protected areas, not even partial protected areas, the fishery can recover. So it's not an impossible task, but it has to be done now. And I would just like to suggest that Taiwan has shown the lead in so many things in the last 4 or 5 years. Why not take the lead in this and go beyond contracts with individual Pacific nations and do joint ventures where you work together to both fish a sustainable resource but also help to preserve them. Once one distant water fishing nation does that, the others are going to be pressured to do it as well. And I think we can see a real turnaround of the whole doomsday scenario we're seeing at the moment with particularly the Western Pacific tuna fishery. And the marine scientists are saying this, the community is saying it, government is saying it in partial ways, but governments, of course, have got so many crises to deal with and problems to deal with that fisheries is one of many. So citizens need to make it apparent that this is important to us. And it's a sign of a vibrant democracy, both in Pacific and Taiwan, if people can say this, bottom up. Listen, leaders do listen if they're in a democracy. They have to stay in power. And like I say, the bottom line is economically it makes sense for both Taiwan and the Pacific nations to work together in partnership, to have not just a total ban on fishing, which damages all parties, not a total exhaustion of the fishery, but a middle ground where we have still a sustainable catch that fisher folk can keep in employment, but we let the fish stock recover as well. And we have the scientific knowledge. All that we need now is political will.